Hello everyone, my name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about containers, Kubernetes, Go as programming language, distributed systems, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So if you have been liking the kinds of videos that I make, you should consider subscribing to the channel and you should follow me on Twitter as well. In this particular video, we are going to talk about mutating admission controllers. We have already talked about what are admission controllers, what are the types of admission controllers in a lot detail in some of the previous videos. So I'm going to link them down in the description if you want to watch them again. So when a particular request is made to Kubernetes API server, those requests can be intercepted by these components or these controllers that we call admission controllers or admission webhooks. And we basically have two types of admission webhooks. One is validating admission webhook and the other one is mutating admission webhook. As the name suggests, in case of validating webhook, we are just going to validate the specific requests that are being made to Kubernetes API server. But in case of mutating admission controllers, we would actually mutate or update or edit the request that is being made to Kubernetes API server. So these are the use cases of these admission controllers. Now, again, we have already discussed about this, but just to summarize, whenever we register a particular admission controller, that admission controller is called or gets triggered with a specific type of request, and that request is admission review type of request, let's say, or admission review object. So whenever we register our admission controller with Kubernetes API server for specific requests, if those specific requests are made to Kubernetes API server, in that case, our admission controller is going to get called with admission review object. And we have already looked into admission review object in a lot detail, but if we very briefly try to talk about it, it contains the request, and this request actually has the resource that was created or the resource for which the request was being made to API server. And once we have done the things with the request, for example, either validated or mutated, we can set the response in the response field of admission review object. So to summarize, we get admission review object and we get the request from admission review. That request has all the details about the request. And once we have either validated or mutated the request, we can set the response in response field of admission review object. Now, in case of validating webhook controller, we are not going to set. There are some fields in the response that we are not going to set. So if we, for example, have a look into the admission review object here. So we have already talked about this request and response fields. So we are going to get the details about the request from request field, but we are going to set the response in this response field. And if we look into admission response, you can see here we have again already talked about all these fields. But in case of validating webhook controller, we don't set values for these two fields. So patch and patch type, and basically there are not a lot of differences between these two webhooks. If we do not set these two fields, it simply means that we have validating webhook controller or we are not applying any patch in the request. But if we have specified these two fields in the response of admission review, it simply means that our admission controller is mutating admission controller. So we have already implemented validating admission controller, but in this particular video, we are actually going to implement mutating admission controller. And that simply means we are going to set value for these two fields. Now, as you can see here, patch type is the type of patch that we are going to apply. Patch simply means that, let's say we have a request or we have an object and we want to apply some patch into that object, or we want to make some modifications into that object. So right now the only allowed value here is JSONPatch, and maybe they will support some other values, but right now the value for path type must be JSONPatch. So let's say let's take a scenario. So for example, we have this JSON field, and let's say name is one, value one, and the other value is two and value two. So for this particular field, let's say we want to add another field, or we want to update this particular value for key 2. In that case, to support all these operations, we have, let's say, a specification, let's assume, and that specification is called JSONPatch. So if we have to update the value of this particular field, what we can say is update, uh, or let's say update value for slash 2, and the value is going to be new value. So here, if you see, this is the operation that we are going to perform. This is the path where the operation is going to be performed on this particular JSON, and the new value is the new value that we want to set for this particular path. So again, if I hope this makes sense. So again, for example, let's say if you have to add something, so what you can do is add, you have to specify operation, and then you will also have to specify where in this particular document you want to add that value. So let's say you want to add that value at slash 2, and let's say if the value is array. So basically you have to specify the path, and we are going to look into how we can come up with the path, but you have to specify operation, you have to specify path, and then you have to specify the value. So this is how we can specify a particular JSON patch for a particular JSON document. Or in other words, if I try to summarize, we can say that to update a particular JSON document, we can, excuse me, we have this specification using which we can specify what are all the things that are to be performed. So if I go ahead and try to show you details about this, so this is the specification, I would say. So you can have a look into all these operations that are supported. So for example, add, remove, replace, copy, move, and test. I'm not going to talk about all these operations in detail because yeah, I mean, if you have a look into this, you would be able to make sense out of it pretty easily. But I just wanted to mention this website, the specification, and things are a bit easier for us because we don't actually have to come up with this particular operation by ourselves. We can actually use any of these libraries to create the patch. So in this particular case, we have to, let's say if we have to change the value for key 2, in that case we can say replace, and this is the patch that we are talking about. If we look at this particular document, this is how a specific patch looks like. So if you see here, it says operation add, and then path is, this is the path in the JSON document, and then this is the value that should be added at this particular path. So for this particular document, this is an operation. Let's say this is a patch. So let's assume we have a particular request. Let's say we have a request that looks somewhat like this: spec, and then version, and let's say this is the JSON document that we have. This is not JSON basically right now, but let you can consider respective JSON document. So let's say we have to change value of version. What we can say is let's say you have to change value for version, what you can say in the operation is change value for version, spec version replace spec dot version with new value. So basically this is the patch that we have to create for this particular JSON document if we have to update the version of this particular resource. And where are we going to get this resource from? We are going to get this resource from admission review dot request, because as I said, let's say if this is the request, this is the resource that we are interested in, and we are trying to, let's say, create this resource. So a create request is going to be made to Kubernetes API server. And if we have written the admission controller, we are going to get this particular request. So yeah, now that we know, now that we know what what is patch and patch type, let's go ahead and actually write the mutating admission controller. But before going there, uh, again, uh, in this particular example, we don't actually have to come up with this particular patch. What we can do is, let's say this is the JSON document that we have, or let's actually create a JSON document. So spec and then version. So let's say we have to update the value of version to new version. And in that case, what we can do is we can create another JSON document. So let's say new version, and then we can use these libraries that we just looked into. So the libraries for Go, either JSONPatch or this one, and using those libraries, we can create a patch for the difference that is there between these two documents. So that's also very easier when we use that library. And this is what we are actually going to do in this particular video. So if we talk about the use case, if you remember, we have an operator that listens for cluster Kubernetes resources. So cluster is a new resource that we introduced, KLUSTER. And as soon as this cluster resource is created on, let's say, your test Kubernetes cluster, a respective DigitalOcean cluster would be created. So we have already written a validating webhook controller for this, but let's assume we have to write a mutating admission controller. If we do not specify a specific version while creating this cluster resource, in that case, we will have to use, let's say, the latest supported version from DigitalOcean. So this is what we have to do. If we try to have a look into, if we try to have a look into how the cluster resource looks like, so this is how the cluster resource looks like now. uh, our use cases, if we do not specify this version field while creating this cluster resource, in that case, our mutating webhook controller should automatically add this field in this resource, and the value of that field is going to be the latest Kubernetes version that DigitalOcean supports. So I hope this problem statement makes sense. And now let's go ahead and try to implement this. So we are going to use, this is the same code base that we have written in previous videos, when we wrote validating webhook controller for our cluster resource. And we have just opened this. We are going to write the mutating admission controller in the same repo, but you are free to use a brand new repo as well. That's not a problem. So first of all, let's go ahead and try to add another another endpoint in our application. So we are going to say mux dot handle, and we are going to create the endpoint or resource path mutate slash v1 alpha 1 slash cluster, because this particular admission controller is for cluster resources. And then we will have to specify the function, but let's go ahead and try to change the validating endpoint as well. We are not going to test or anything. We are not going to do anything with validating admission controller in this particular video, but just uh, to make things more clear or to have consistency, let's do this. Apart from that, to actually implement validating or sorry, mutating admission controller, we are also going to create a new package called mutate or admission. And inside admission, we are going to create a file named mutate.go. And this particular admission package is going to, if you see here, this is the signature that the validate function has, and this is the exact same signature that uh, mutate function or mutate function should also have. So let's name it serve cluster validation to serve cluster mutation. Again, if you do not understand this code base, we wrote this entire code from scratch in one of the previous videos. So I will link that down again, and you can have a look into that. So let's go ahead and try to import that package, the new package that we just created. And let's call, okay, so now that we have the serve cluster mutation function in the admission package, what we have to do is, if we go ahead and create a mutating admission configuration Kubernetes resource, so once we have our application running, we will have to register our application or admission or our admission controller with API server, and we do that by creating another Kubernetes resource named mutating admission configuration. In case of validating webhook configuration, we created, if you see here, we created validating webhook configuration. But in case of mutating webhook configuration or mutating admission controller, we will have to create mutating webhook configuration. So I'm just going to copy this manifest here, and let's name it mutate hyphen webhook dot YAML. We are not going to change anything here because we know that these configurations look exactly similar. We are just going to change the kind to mutating webhook configuration, and we are interested in cluster resources. They are part of this particular group and this version, and we are good. Now, if we go ahead and try to create this entire thing. When I say entire thing, I actually mean we will have to create the secret that contains certificates, and then the actual deployment that is going to run this code. Our mutating admission controller is actually going to get called. This particular function is actually going to get called, but it is going to fail because we are not actually responding with anything. So to respond with the proper response, first of all, we'll have to do the mutation in the request. So if you see here, we actually try to create a cluster resource, and this is how our cluster resource looks like. So first of all, we will have to get this resource from the request. And we know that a request is in form of admission review, and we know how to parse that. So again, I'm just going to copy this entire code that can be used. Again, this can be improved. Obviously, we can have another helper function that is going to have this code, and then we can call that function. But just to show you these things, I am just going to copy this block of code. And if you do not understand something here, I have a detailed video on this. So I would link that, and if you watch this, these things are going to make sense to you. It won't be a problem. Okay, so now if you see here, we actually have the cluster resource that was that was being created, or for which cluster resource the request was being made to Kubernetes API server. So once we have this cluster, what we have to do is, if you remember what we talked about, we have to check if this particular version field is set or not. So what we can do is, we can say if cluster dot spec dot version is equals to empty. In that case, we have to actually apply the patch. So what we have to do is, let's create a copy of this cluster resource. So a new variable basically. So new cluster equals to a dot deep copy. We don't necessarily have to use deep copy. We can just create a new replica of that object. But I'm just using deep copy here to create a new copy of that object, of that cluster resource. And if new cluster dot spec dot version is empty, in that case, new cluster dot spec dot version should be set to the latest version that DigitalOcean supports. So we are going to say latest cube version, and this latest cube version is going to be in DigitalOcean package. And if you see here, we have a lot of code already written there. Again, I'm not saying this is very good code. Maybe all these functions should be converted to method on DigitalOcean client. But yeah, uh, I think you get the idea. So we are going to have a function called latest cube version, and once we have latest cube version, this is going to, let's say, return string. And if I try to specify what exactly this function is going to do, and it is used to set in the cluster resource if version is not set. And to figure this out, we can refer the code here again. And it is going to, we are going to call latest cube version with, again, specification of cluster. So first of all, we'll have to get the client, and once we have client, we can call, this is DigitalOcean client, and on DigitalOcean client we can call get option that gets us the details about the versions. So Or we should ideally return error from here, but I'm not going to return error just to simplify the things. Error initializing DigitalOcean client. We don't exactly know what the error is, but in this particular case, we know the error. So I think we dot print error getting options using DO client. And now what we have to return is options dot versions Kubernetes version, and then we have to return slug. So 0.slug, and I think we are good. So okay, we have to pass the specification. So new cluster dot spec. So if you see here, our actual motive is if we have not set the version field while creating this cluster resource, we a version field must be added with the value of the latest Kubernetes version that is supported by DigitalOcean, and that is the reason we are calling DigitalOcean API here. If you see, to get the options. Uh, now that we have now that we have set now that we have the object, how the actual object should look like, we can create the patch. So if you see here, we let's say we got this particular document, and we know that our expected document is this. So now that we have both the versions, we can create the patch using the library that we talked about. So we can use any library that we want to. Let's say we have to use JSONPatch, and let's go ahead and try to import it. JSONPatch, and then create patch actually expects two documents, and these are the two documents that it expects. One is, let's say, original, and the other one is the one that we are expecting. So the original is, I would say, admission preview dot request dot object dot raw. And again, I have already talked about this. The actual cluster resource is going to be stored in this raw field of request dot object, and we have to also convert this new cluster where we have to set where we have set the version into a byte. So let's go ahead and try to do that as well. So JSON dot Marshall, and we want to convert new cluster. So so JSON cluster dot print error converting new cluster resource to JSON. And we will have to obviously handle the error here. Uh, Return error or write error to response. We are not doing that right now, again, to save time, but this is ideally what we will have to do. And once we have the patch, so create patch returns JSON patch. If you see a list of operations and error, so we are going to call it operations colon error. And if error is not equals to nil, in that case, again, we will have to handle it. So this is not the way to handle the errors, but yeah, just to give you an idea. And once we have the operation, so now if I go back to our document again, now we have this operation, let's say, that needs to be performed on the original document to make it to what we want it to be. So I hope that makes sense. So we are going to also display it, and once we show it to you, things are going to actually make more sense. So now let's go ahead and try to create the response. So response colon equals to admission response, and here we are going to specify UID. UID is going to be admission review dot request dot UID. We have already talked about UID in previous video, and allowed is going to be true. And if you see here, now we have to specify patch and patch type. So because we want to mutate the request, so patch type is going to be, we know that patch type, the patch type that is supported right now is JSON. So let's create a variable named JSON patch type, and the value is going to be patch type JSON patch, and then we can specify JSON patch type here. Now we also have to specify the actual patch. So to specify the patch, the type of patch is slice of byte. So we will have to convert this ops to slice of byte. So let's try to do that. So JSON dot Marshall, and we want to convert ops into slice of byte. So patch colon error, and if error is not equals to nil, in that case we are obviously going to handle the error, but for now we are just going to print f error converting operations to slice of byte. And just to log the things, let's see what exactly the patch is. Patch that we have is percentage plus v, and or let's say percentage s. then patch, and we are also going to set it in patch. So yeah, I hope this makes sense. And once we have the response, will have to set this response in the admission review object that we got. So admission review dot response equals to the response that we have formed, and then we have to actually write this admission review back to the HTTP response. So we have that code already here, and let's just go ahead and try to copy that. So we have admission review, and let's just copy and paste this. So yeah, I think we are good. Now let's go ahead and try to at least build this project once. So we basically have two libraries, two more modules here for JSONPatch. Both of them are pretty okay to use, I would say. So I'm going to go ahead with this one. Let's get rid of the other one. Okay, so once we have built the binary, let's go ahead and try to create the Docker image. So docker build -t, let's call it 2.0 and context. Once we have pushed this particular image, we will have to change our deployment. And in deployment, we are going to specify newly built image. Uh, if you are watching this particular video without watching the other videos about admission controllers, these things are might be confusing for you. So I highly recommend watching those videos first before actually continuing with this one. So if you see here, the image has been pushed. So now what we are going to do is we are actually going to deploy all these things that we have in manifests directory. So it is going to create a secret. That secret is going to have the TLS cert and TLS key to run our HTTPS server that is serving the admission controllers. And then we are going to mount the same secret on this deploy.yaml. Once deploy.yaml is created, we also create service.yaml. And once service.yaml is created, this is the service.yaml that is going to get referred from mutating and validating webhook controllers. And then we also have some RBAC manifests that are pretty easy, I would say. So let's go ahead and try to first create the secret. So create -f manifests and then search secret.yaml. Once secret.yaml is created, create everything from manifests directory. So if you see here, deployment was created, mutating webhook configuration was created, role binding role, service, validating webhook configuration was created, and we are good. Now let's go ahead and try to let's go ahead and try to create an actual cluster resource to see what's happening. So I'm going to see the logs of the controller pod that we are running, and let's create that cluster resource. So create -f, and we know that the cluster resource is at no matches for kind cluster, and we will have to create CRD first to get the before creating CR. Create -f. And once CRD is created, let's go ahead and create the cluster resource. Okay, so it says error when creating this particular resource, internal error occurred, failed calling webhook, the server could not find the requested resource. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. And the problem is, if you see here, so what we have done is we have, if we look at our code main.go, we have specified that our servers or our services to mutate and validate the resources are listening on this particular path. So but we will also have to specify this while registering these controllers. Otherwise, if we do not specify the path, if we look at, let's say if we look at mutate webhook, we have not specified path anywhere. We are specifying the service that is to be called, but which particular resource path of that service should be called. If we do not specify the path, this is the problem that we are going to get into. So let's specify the path as well. And we know that for mutate, this is the path that should be queried or that should be called. And for validating webhook, we also have to specify path. And okay, so now that we have changed the manifests, at least validating and mutating, let's go ahead and try to apply them. So apply -f manifest mutating webhook.yaml, and we are also going to change validating webhook.yaml. So both of these resources have been configured. Now let's go ahead and try to create the cluster one resource. So if you see here, it says admission webhook clusters.vvxing.dev denied the request. The specified version is not supported. Now, let's look at this. Let's look at this log. This is interesting. So errors secret dio secret not found, getting token. So when we try to query DigitalOcean API, we also try to create DigitalOcean client. And to create DigitalOcean client, we read a secret here, and that is the secret that is not found. So let's go ahead and try to create that secret. But let me quickly try to make sure that this token that I'm using is correct or not. Okay, so yeah, this is unnecessary. I just wanted to check the token is correct or not. Now let's go ahead and try to create the resource once again. Okay, so if you see here, cluster 0 was created, and if we try to look into this cluster 1 manifest, so vim if you see here, we are not actually specifying version. And if we are not specifying the version, it simply means that we are setting the version using our. So if you see here, patch that we have, we were able to, again, if you see here, we were able to, if we look at this particular source file here, we are trying to print the patch. So patch that we have, this is the patch that was created. So operation is add, and in spec slash version, add this particular value. So if we try to have a look into this particular manifest, and then if we want to add version here, so this is the operation, this is the patch that should be, this is the patch that should be applied. And that is the patch that we were able to figure out by using that library here, JSONPatch.createPatch. So we actually created the expected resource, how the expected resource should look like, and how the original resource is or document is, and then we used the library to actually come up with this particular patch. And once that patch was applied, if you see here, we are going to we responded with this particular we responded with this particular output. So if you see here, we have set up patch and we also have set up patch type. But if you see here, once we are responding from validating webhook, we are not setting either patch or patch type. So this is for mutating webhook, and this output is for or from validating webhook. So this also proves that in this I would say handler chain, let's say initially mutating admission controller is called and then validating admission controller is called. So I hope these things are I mean this made sense to you. If you did not understand something, don't hesitate to comment that. I would be more than happy to make sure that you understand that particular thing. If I try to summarize the things once again, so our use cases to actually uh, when we try to create a cluster resource, let's say this is the cluster resource. When we try to create this cluster resource, if we have not specified any version, in that case, we will not be able to create the Kubernetes resource basically. So in that case, what we have to do is we have to actually specify a default version, and that default version is going to be the newest version that is Revolution supports. This is our use case. And to achieve that, what we have done is we have written a mutating admission controllers that listens on create events of clusters and then calls this particular endpoint from this service of default namespace. And at this particular location, we have written uh, uh, let's say a program that gets the cluster and checks if the cluster dot spec dot version is actually empty or not. If it's empty, then it is set to the newest version that DigitalOcean supports. And I think this is pretty easy logic, I would say. And once we have set up the version, we have to create how our request should look like. So so this is how our request looked like when it came to admission controller, but we figured that this is how it should look like. So if I try to, for example, explain these things to you, so at this particular location, So this is gate, and after this particular line, we have changed we have changed that k to be this, and we can say that this is new cluster. And now what we are doing is, if you see here, using create patch, we are just creating patch. I mean, the update that this particular document requires to get into this particular state, let's say simply. And once we have that patch, we are just going to apply that patch in in the request, and we can do that by setting the correct response, and I think we are good. This is nowhere production ready. We have not handled the errors, but I think this should make sense to you. And we have also looked into the logs. Once the mutating admission controller is called, because we have, if you see, we have, for the same resource, we have registered mutating and validating admission controller. So mutating was called first, and then validating. I hope this made sense to you. Again, I'm so sorry about the lighting, and thank you for watching. If you think this is going to be helpful to your friends, your colleagues, share it with them, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much.